what if we could bring to bear nature's incredible understanding of structure to change not just the look, but the very shape of this city?
When it comes to the structure of our buildings, what we've done so far is exploit nature's genius. We've used its materials to build our buildings. But we use far too much. The lesson from nature: less is more.
Trees are one of the most amazing structures on the planet, and they rely very heavily on tension. On a microscopic level, there's lots of short, stiff cells held together by fibres in tension, and this creates a matrix, a stiff grid that is incredibly strong. I'm going to do an experiment to see how the structural principle of trees can be applied to the structure of buildings. This model approximates to the way that we normally build structures. It uses a grid of columns and relies upon stiff joints. It's inherently quite unstable and needs to have quite a lot of additional structure to make it stiff. So let's see what happens when we put a load of weight on it.
A little push to the side simulates the wind blowing against the building.
42 for 45 kilos of sugar. And you can see it's got a hell of a wobble on it. Quite an extraordinary amount of wobble. It's actually showing the behavioural characteristics that a lot of buildings have, and a lot of buildings actually flex quite a lot in the wind. This structure suffers from the same inherent instability as the previous one. But what I'm going to do is put a twist into it. And so it's creating a cross-braced tube. And if we now tie off these node points, we're starting to replicate the cellular structure of timber. And even though we're using the same material as in the previous one, this one should be able to take far more load without failing.
As I pile on the weight, I can see it's not bending, it's not wobbling. I've run out of sugar. In fact, it would take about 4 times as many bags as this to make it collapse. When I push it, you can see it's got virtually no wobble at all. Using this kind of design, we can make buildings stronger and much more stable. The principle of minimizing materials occurs in some of the most unlikely places in nature. Once again, the humble lily pad proves to be much more than just pretty pond decoration.
One of the most famous examples of biomimicry in architecture is when the gardener Joseph Paxton lifted up the Victoria lily leaf and drew inspiration from this incredible structure under here to design the roof of Crystal Palace over 150 years ago.
Paxton found that each leaf is supported by radial ribs, which are stiffened by slender cross ribs. This helps maintain rigidity and strength across the leaf. Even though Crystal Palace was made entirely from glass and cast iron, his knowledge of the lily pad made it possible to make a light yet strong roof, big enough to cover 18 acres.
It was the first modular building, it was one of the first prefabricated buildings, and he even tested all of the individual sections with troops of soldiers marching across them to make sure they were up to strength. So in many ways, it was truly the first modern piece of architecture.
When it comes to strength of structure, one of nature's great savants is the spider. What the spider does is use tension in an incredibly efficient way to carry very large loads. Germany has long been a centre for biomimetics, so it's hardly surprising that the Germans turned to nature for inspiration when it was their turn to host the Olympics. The Munich Olympic Stadium is notorious for the terrorist attacks on the Games of '72, but it's also become one of the most iconic Olympic venues.
What are the big design ideas behind these beautiful roof structures?
The roof was to be very light in order to get the contrast to the landscape, which is kind of heavy, earthbound. And the roof is more kind of a flying cloud, a very transparent, light, immaterial cloud. This was the basic impression. And it's kind of an observation of nature if you observe a net of a spider, which comes very close to those shapes.
Like a spider's web, the stadium shows grace and strength working together. The concept was to create a lightweight, transparent structure which would envelop a stadium, swimming pool and ice rink and stop the spectators getting rained on.
What I really like about the Munich Olympic Stadium is that the whole subtlety and sensitivity of the place, beyond these amazing lightweight tension structures inspired by spiders' webs and by nature's minimalism, there's a whole attitude that has bent and warped the landscape to create little depressions and natural amphitheatres in which games can go on, football and rowing and running. There's no great big bombastic statements about architecture. It's very sensitive, very approachable, very friendly. And above all, it strikes me as being incredibly contemporary to modern day architecture.
It's all about using the minimum amount of material to cover the biggest area. Given the planet's diminishing resources, there's still a lot we can learn from Munich.
Nature only puts structure where it's absolutely necessary. It optimizes, because the time and energy used to build a home or a skeleton can be the difference between life and death for an organism. Survival of the fittest means the very best of design. And it's this ruthlessness that we need to apply to all of our structures.
More than 60 years after the end of World War II, efforts continue to bring those who committed abuse under the Nazis to justice.